Pues comenzamos entonces. Buenas tardes, un placer verdaderamente estar aquí y voy a presentar a los ponentes de esta sesión. A mi derecha está el profesor Fernando Ariza, profesor de Humanidades, de Literatura del CEU, la Universidad CEU San Pablo, de literatura, pero también me has dicho que es profesor internacional o en cursos,
en cursos internacionales.
Cursos internacionales. Sí. Como ya saben ustedes, pues va a hablar de Emily Dikinson, God in the Backyard, nada menos, Dios en el patio trasero, la poesía religiosa de Emily Dikinson. Va a hablar él primero por una cuestión que tiene que marcharse, ineludible, y aquí a mi lado izquierdo pues está un gran especialista en Roy Campbell, Emilio Domínguez. Tengo una gran satisfacción en estar aquí moderando esta mesa porque él ha sido alumno mío en la Universidad Complutense y es doctor internacional, doctor europeo, también por la Universidad CEU San Pablo. Es doctor en filología inglesa, profesor de inglés y, como digo, pues un grandísimo especialista, un grandísimo conocedor. Quizá el término especialista a mí últimamente no me gusta demasiado, porque a veces el ser especialista pues es estar muy pendiente de detalles y no ir al fondo. Es un gran conocedor de Roy Campbell y Roy Campbell pues tuvo una ruta en la vida muy compleja y llegó luego al literary nomad, como él dice, un nómada literario, y luego ese camino de nomadismo le lleva hasta Dios. De manera que vuestra es la palabra.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Lo tengo preparado en inglés, en español, tal vez tenga sentido en inglés, no sé si, sobre todo porque él es una poeta inglesa. Entonces, tanto los textos como no creo que haya ningún problema en que lo haga en inglés. Si alguien... No, perfecto. Okay, the title of my paper is God in the Backyard, Natural Elements in the Religious Poetry of Emily Dikinson. The contrast between the apparently formal simplicity of Emily Dickinson's poetry and its extraordinary interpretative complexity has produced a huge amount of analysis of her work. Harold Bloom is aware of this complexity and has pointed it out on more than one occasion. And this is a quote: Emily Dickinson and William Blake seem to me the two poets in Anglo-American tradition who will revive themselves something of William Shakespeare's highly original cognitive power. And there is another quote of another text, and he wrote, "Of all poems written in English in the 19th and 20th century, I judge Emily Dickinson to present us in the most authentic cognitive difficulties. Vast and subtle intellect cannot in itself make a poet. The essential qualities are inventiveness, mastery of trope and craft, and that weird flair for intuition, significance through rhythm, to which we can give no proper name. Dickinson, and I think that's the point, has all this, as well as a mind original and powerful that scarcely has begun even now to catch up with her." These quotes, although somewhat extensive, tell us two very important things about the American poet. The first related to the extraordinary quality of her work. For Bloom, if you know Harold Bloom, is one of the most important philologists of our days, the great Shakespearean and it's a specialist in Shakespearean expert. To compare her with the Bard is a declaration of geniality. The second refers to the fact that she is a creator of difficult comprehension, although we would venture to say that the cognitive power to which the critic refers is not so much obscurity or impenetrability as interpretative richness. This point is worth emphasizing as it shall inform our session and the approach we will make to her religious poetry. To understand part of her poetic work, and especially her religious poetry, it is necessary to contextualize the author in the in the time and place where she lived. One must say that Dikinson's biography increases the complication associated with her poetry because it breaks with all the molds of her time, although not in the sense normally attributed to that expression. Emily Elizabeth Dikinson was born in Amherst, a small Massachusetts town deep in New England, in 1830. She belonged to one of the best families of the region, which earned its living with the tranquility and ease enabled by the intense Puritanism of that region. Her interest in spirituality began very early. At the age of 17, she entered the women's seminary at Mount Holyoke, where the principal, Mary Lyon, formed young women to send them as missionaries. In the years she spent there, she learned both human and theological science. I will make the point that this human science, she was very interested in biology and natural science. And we will see that in her poetry, she uses a lot of concepts that come from natural science. But she never got to convert, that is, to make the decision to go abroad as a missionary or a missionary's wife. Emily received pressures both in the seminar and later to accept the mission, but she always resisted to do so. This would be the first of her passive rebellion against the official religion that surrounded her. This is the Puritanism. Because of an illness, she returned to with her family. The time she spent at the seminar was the only time she lived outside Amherst in her entire life. Since then, her living space was limited in its geography, although it was expanded symbolically thanks to her epistolary relations. Her enigmatic personality, brilliant and difficult in equal parts, make her avoid human relationship while she expanded her epistolary ties and expressed her emotions through poetry. She kept an intense correspondence. More than 1,000 letters are kept nowadays written by her. With family, friends, mentors, and literary critics. She wrote much of her poems in such epistles and in tight notebooks that she would never publish. She published only 3 or 4 poems in her life, and the rest of her poetry were as I have mentioned, in the letters she wrote and in some notebooks that she made it physically. Her current corpus consists of more than 1,700 poems. She only published a few in the local press. As the pages of her poetry notebooks grew and her epistolary friendship multiplied, her relations with her neighbors receded almost to the point of disappearing. Soon she stopped crossing the limits of her family home. She preferred to walk in the countryside, to study in the garden, or to read indoors. Much of the relations about the natural context appears because she had a very small human context. She was much in contact with plants, with the forest and animals that she could see. New England was at that time one of the great bastions of Puritanism, of Congregationalist inspiration, which contributed to the fact that religion was from the beginning one of the great poetic themes of Dikinson. However, since her denial of conversion, she created an invisible barrier between her relationship with the God and the official religion of Amherst. Poets, and this is a quote, rebelled against a rigid Puritanism that has maintained its icy grip on the Connecticut River Valley from the 17th century to its day. We believe that the substitution of black for white is a good representation of her personality. In one moment, she left the typical black dress of the Puritans, and she began dressing only in white clothes. And she called herself actually like a rebel nun. So it's quite interesting, this idea. But in a letter to her friend and sister-in-law, she wrote what follows. The bells are ringing, Susie is her sister-in-law, north and east, and your own village bell. And the people who love God are expecting to go to meet. Don't you go, Susie? Not to their meeting, but come with me this morning to the church within our hearts, where the bells are always ringing, and the preacher, whose name is Love, shall intercede there for us. This same idea is expressed in a later poem, lyrically, and I think it's one of the most famous poems she wrote, where she insists on the importance, for better of worse, on the preacher. You know, the Puritanism, the word was very important, much more than the sacrament that didn't exist. So the poem, it's not a very long poem, it's like this. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for the dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings, and instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all alone. Well, this is the first mention of natural elements. The bobolink is kind of a bird. I think in Spanish it's called the charlatan. I've got no idea what kind of animal it is, but it's like a small bird. And it appears like the chorister. So instead of the people singing, they have the natural elements, the birds. And the preacher is a natural preacher, is God, and there is here a noted clergyman. And the sermon is never long. No? This is a funny thing. It's like, okay, the most noted clergyman is being God, doesn't speak too much because we don't need like long sermons. It seems to me that this poem shows the interpretative problems raised by Dickinson poetry, since the readings that can be made are many and in many ways contradictory. In this poem could be a critic to the, I said it's contradictory because it could be like a critic to the natural, the main official religion, but at the same time it's very spiritual, and it's opened the window to the mystery that is one of the essence of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. In this poem, there appears a thematic association that will be repeated in the rest of her work, the connection between God and creation. Thus, man, nature, and God were never longer separate entities, and man's relations to nature and God assumes to well-defined patterns, and he has merged with universal meaning. Being a very common topic in English romanticism, Dickinson changes this idea, this association between God and nature, into small things, not only talking about forests, mountains, nature in general, and the creation as a general, but about small things like insects, like birds, like small animals, like grass. For that reason, I entitled this paper as God in the Backyard. The use of irony, very common in her poetry, sharpens the multifaceted personality in such a way that she may be represented as agnostic, a heretic, a skeptic, a Christian. Logically, we start from Puritanism as her original religion. So being heretic inside the Puritanism can produce a more close relation with other kind of religions, actually, or other kind of spiritualities. No, we'll talk later in her relation about her relation with Catholicism, for example. Let us return to her rebellion. Shortly before her death, she wrote in a letter that she considered herself a pugilist and poet. Considering herself a poet is nothing new, but her first self-denomination could be interested with the famous Unamunian idea describing agony of Christianity. In much of her poems, there appears the crisis of faith expressed in the most explicit and at the same time painful way. Let us see some poems where there is no doubt about the existence of God, but rather about His presence, His love, His consideration of all the human being. Of course, and this is the poem, I prayed, and did God care? I have been caring so much on the air. A bird has stamped her foot and cried, give me. And in another, Those dying then knew where they went. They went to God's right hand. That hand, and this is amputated now, and God cannot be found. And the last one, know that He exists somewhere in silence. He has hid His rare life from our gross eyes. Despite her crisis of faith, she thinks of herself as a boxer, a pugilist, I did mention, a fighter, a combatant that lives in that manner, in an intense and passionate way before a moderate and rational attitude. And this is another quote of another poetry. Much madness is the divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense, the starkest madness. Talking about the spirituality. Time goes very far. Far from the previous poem, and for many others, she wrote where the pain and absence of even unbelief are shown without any warmth or ambiguity. Others shows faith as a royal treasure, like this one. To lose one's faith, surpass the loss of an estate. Because estates can be replenished, faith cannot. Inherit with life, belief, but once can be annihilated, and a single clause, and being's beggary. We agree that Dikinson's poetry oscillates playfully, yet with a deadly seriousness between affirmation and denial, and any attempt to pin down her beliefs may leave a reader feeling simultaneously beckoned by meaning and baffled by mystery. Can I ask for some water, please? I need. Okay. Sorry, I need to drink water. The pronunciation in English is a little bit more complicated. Her religious poetry moved between the crisis of faith, the parody, the loud affirmation in believing, and the almost mystical closeness of God. The only news I know is bulletins all day from immortality. The only news I see, tomorrow and today, perchance eternity. The only one I meet is God, the only street, existence, this traversed. In other news there be, or admirable show, I'll tell it to you. Amid the many ways in which Dikinson's religious ideas have been interpreted and connected to the theme of nature, there is one that understanding it in its measure may have some interest. We are referring to the influence of Catholicism in her poetry work. Trying to avoid some overinterpretation, we need to begin by asking whether the poet has contact with the Catholic Church, since Catholics were late to New England. In fact, it was not until 1840 when the first Catholic Mass was celebrated and the first church was not consecrated until 1871. Most of the Catholics came from Ireland, an emigration provoked by the potato crisis, also called the Irish Great Famine. That happened in the middle of century. It's very well known when I don't know what kind of illness appeared into the potatoes, and most of the Irish people had to immigrate to the United States. The arrival of Roman Catholic immigrants was not well received by those who began to call themselves nativists, for they consider foreign papists only believed in fiction and obeyed foreign rules. These ideas provoked verbal attacks from the press and even physical aggression, such as the Philadelphia riots of 1844. Dickinson met through the Irish another kind of religiosity, especially through Margaret Maggie Meyer, a beloved Irish maid in the family. Another way in which in her letters we can see how the references of this woman that worked in her house and was another kind of religious in the context of the Puritanism of the area, where the Irish arrived with their more natural and more vivid religion as, I don't know if because of the Irish or because of the Catholicism, but the idea that it was something different. Another way in which Dickinson acquainted herself with Catholicism was through books. Through her letters, I'm going to change this. Okay, there are some books where in her letters she wrote about different books that had references to the Catholicism, but we don't have time enough. So I'm going to read some poems where she talks about natural elements and also Catholic elements. Elements, for example, the nuns, the Virgin Mary, or some sacraments that were not in the other, the Puritanism she practiced. In her poetry, there are several references to Catholicism, although they are all indirect, referring to the Virgin Mary, the sacrament or the liturgy. As we have already mentioned above, the interpretation that have been offered are most varied, and each can understand what interests him. For example, poem 18, all the poems of Emily Dickinson had no title. They're just because they were published once she died, and they only have numbers. So this poem ends like this: in the name of the bee and of the butterfly and of the breeze, amen. As you can see, this is the Catholic benediction, but instead of saying in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, she said the bee, la abeja, the butterfly, and the breeze, all natural elements. We could consider this like a parody or a joke, but the bee, well, actually there is a very interesting interpretation that could be called, especially into that works perfectly into the Catholic faith. In the name of the bee, the maker, the creator, because bee is also the verb to be in English, and of the butterfly, the animal that's transformed into one little worm, into a wonderful, like Christ glorious, bursting from death, cocoon, like Saint Spirit, Christ, Jesus Christ. And on the breeze that could be perfectly the breath of God, the Dator Numunemu, the Holy Ghost. And although the parallels do not seem to be forced, others have, of course, seen some parody. I think it goes closer to the other interpretation. The first poem I read before, talking about going to the church, it has another version, but instead of church, it talks about the Mass. The Mass is a Catholic church, and it also happens in natural elements. Farther in summer than the birds, pathetic from the grass, a minor nation celebrates its unobtrusive Mass. It's like some insects, birds, and creating a mass of course, in Emily Dickinson, her poetry is always, natural elements have a positive connotation. In another poem, O sacrament of summer days, O last communion in the haze, permit a child to join, the sacred emblems to partake, the consecrated bread to take, and the thine immoral wine. Talking about bread, talking about wine, and talking about communion, of course. It's and it's the last communion. Are all Catholic references. 5 minutes. Okay. There is one last element I would like to mention, that is the presence of the Virgin Mary. There are 3 poems where she talk about this, of course, very Catholic element of the religion, of the spirituality, in a very interesting way. Of course, she is not Catholic at all, but the references she make. Mine to supplicate Madonna, if Madonna be. Madonna, it's an Italian version, it's an Italian word to mention the Virgin Mary, because in the United States at that time, Catholicism is something European, is something like associated to the Middle Ages or to the Papism, so the Virgin and the Renaissance. So it's not strange to call her Virgin Mary like Madonna with 2 N's. If Madonna be, no service, could be so far to creature, Christ omitted me. In another poem she said, sweet mountains, you tell me no lie, never deny me, never fly, those same unvarying eyes turn on me when I fail or faint, or take the royal names in vain, their far, slow, violet gaze, my strong Madonnas cherish still, and this is the wayward nun. She mentioned herself as a wayward nun. Beneath the hill, whose service is to you her latest worship, when the day fades from the firmament away to lift her brows on you. Well, and I finish. Our interest in considering Emily Dickinson's religious poem lies in the realization of her strangeness towards the religion lived as a child and deeply present in her world, a distance perhaps provoked by the Puritan rigidity and aggravated by her passionate and at the same time intellectual nature that caused her to live her faith as a constant battle. This crisis makes her seek new paths or new religious perspectives that she found in her own nature and to a lesser extent in her few Catholic influences that she lived, as a new and foreign music pleasant to her ears. This new religiosity was attached in her poetry to the natural world, finding a correspondence between the vital, colorful, and spontaneous Irish Catholicism from the perspective of a Puritan culture and little animals like the bobolink, the bee, the butterfly, or plants like the grass or the other plants that appears. The result, from our point of view, is an original, strange, and powerful religious sensibility shown through her verses. Thank you very much. And sorry for my accent, it's not perfect, but well, I try to do my best. Okay, thank you.
El doctor Emilio Domínguez Díaz tiene ahora la palabra.
Right, thank you very much for coming. And that's by chance we're having today the possibility of talking about Roy Campbell next to Puerta de Toledo. And 15 miles on our left, we got also Puerta Bisagra, the old Puerta Bisagra, just the entrance to Toledo, which is supposed to represent a very important city, a vital idea, a vital concept, you know, in Roy Campbell's life, okay? Let me give you some recommendations. First of all, you got a kind of booklet, this one in here, which was prepared for the Congress we dedicated to Roy Campbell some months ago. And it was due to the 60-year anniversary. It did happen in 1957, and it was in April in Toledo. It was the best place where we could do it, and thanks to the Carmelites, we could do it in there some months ago, as I said before. Another recommendation is that the whole text, or the more formal way of the text, I'm going to talk to you about the literary aspect, the nomad life of Roy Campbell and that road to God, could be represented, could be read in more detail and more deeply on a PDF document I sent Antonio Barnes. And if you are really interested in the formal aspect of this speech, you can ask him for it, you know, just a PDF document. Talking about Roy Campbell, it is important, for example, the previous references I had today. I didn't know Antonio Barnes was talking about Borges. Borges was important to Roy Campbell. Similarly, Javier also talked about Pessoa, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and they all, could be Portuguese, could be French, any other language. Roy Campbell was a very good translator, not only a writer, not only a poet, but also a good translator. And that's why it is difficult to pigeonhole him. It's very difficult to describe Roy Campbell and decide what kind of job he did, what kind of profession he had, or what kind, of people he used to go with. That's, the difficulty we usually have whenever we have to face the character, the figure, the literary or the human side of Roy Campbell. To start with, we must talk about marginalization. Why did Roy Campbell, why was he marginalized? And basically we have to date back to Bloomsbury Group. The literary set, all artists and writers in the 1920s, roughly, in the mid-20s, led by Virginia Woolf, would be the first time in which we feel that after the Flaming Therapy, his first collection of poems became so important, Virginia Woolf led, along with Vita Sackville West, decided that Roy Campbell was a kind of enemy. The Zulu poet, he was nicknamed the Zulu poet because he was coming from South Africa, was supposed a new and fresh air in the literary aspect, in the literary world of the mid or the early 20s in England. For that reason, marginalization played an important role initially, and that's why he was marginalized, he was harshly criticized by all the people, as he was a new man in arts, in literature, and he was just 21 when he wrote The Flaming Terrapin. Influenced basically by the modernism, by French modernism, and characters or figures such as Rimbaud, Baudelaire, or Verlaine. Also, this produced his escape to France. We're starting with the first step, the first stage of his nomadism, and that's the stage to France, or the step to France, because he wasn't recognized highly, he wasn't praised at all. His poetry suffered lots of criticism, and for that reason he decided he didn't want to write anymore. And he proved that he tried to do other jobs, such as, for example, being a fisherman, being a boxer, being a bullfighter, or just a joster in Martigues, in the Camargue, in Aix-en-Provence, in lots of places next to the Mediterranean in the south of France. The escape to France represented finding a new way of life, just the contact with the people, with rural areas, those aspects that made him think in a different way. He didn't think about his literary career, he didn't think about writing a new collection of poetry, he didn't think about, for example, the possibility of writing more poems, and the fact of having postponed that idea of modernism in literature, in British literature, was left behind. For that reason, when he was in France for some years, he also received the visit of lots of people, lots of other writers, important writers in America and England, and he thought he was able to catch lots of ideas. This led him to the possibility of writing or just reading about saints, for example, like Saint John of the Cross or Santa Teresa de Jesus as well. And they were something like inspired in the new kind of poetry he wanted to write whenever his time allowed him, which was rather difficult indeed. Actually, the possibility of working with or just doing lots of different jobs in that area, in the Mediterranean area, didn't allow him to have a serious life or just to have a calm life regarding poetry, regarding the production of literature. For that reason, we reached the conclusion of his first visit to South Africa, because he was South African like Tolkien, and it was the very first time when he was 19, the very first time he left South Africa for England was at that time, after the First World War ended. His nomadic life also implied the trip, the journey to South Africa, and to be in contact with people such as Lawrence van der Post or other important writers in South Africa, who were able to support him in the idea of being boycotted by the government and the Colour Bar, because he suffered and he went for the people who were harshly criticized, people who were denied the condition just for the mere fact of being niggers or being Negroes, right? So the problem of racism, which he was later accused of, was nothing to do with him at all. His religious accomplishment just on this way, on this trip to God, this kind of road, this way, this path to God, has to do with his coming back to France again after leaving South Africa. He suffered lots of experiences in there, and when coming back to France, he started to discover shrines, Mithras, the Roman god Mithras, and he starts doing some research about the possibility of the influence in the new ritual of Christianism. Christians, according to Roy Campbell, and just following the patterns of something relatively new, because all the very factual deeds or the factual information about Mithras came from 1904, the beginning of the century, and actually it was in the Anatolian area where the first tablets were found. So there were no possibilities to have or to date back to Mithraism in the previous centuries. But he started to find a kind of connection with Roman times. And Roman times in the south of France, in the Mediterranean area, supposed or implied the contact with the ancient religion, that ancient religion of Romans. For that reason, he started approaching, getting closer to the character, to the figure of this god Mithras. And this god Mithras would be, in the short run, a kind of connection to God, to Christ, to our religion, to Catholicism, which will be fulfilled some years later in Altea, in Alicante, in 1935, on June the 24th. Before leaving France, he had the possibility to know Barcelona. It was in November 1933 when he left France for some problems he had in there, and he regretted leaving France, but he never regretted being in Spain or getting to know Spain, because he was very aware, very fond of, very keen on Spain, and for that reason, he usually tried to put it, to place it on his poetry, on his poems, though unfortunately he hasn't been highly recognized, highly praised in our literature, I mean in the Spanish literature. The escape to Barcelona, it was in 1933, and it was rather strange because they usually came from a rural area, both in South Africa, also in England, and even in France. And he had two daughters, Anne and Tess, and it was, they had a problem because they really missed nature and the contact with the sun, the South African scenery or the Mediterranean one in the north or in the south of France. So for those reasons, he didn't like quite a lot the possibility of staying in Barcelona for a lifetime, though life was cheaper, obviously, rather cheap, than in the south of France. Going to the Mediterranean area in Spain, he first found Valencia, and then they came across the city, well, the village of Altea at that time, with a population of around 1,500 people. So those inhabitants in there were really fond of Roy Campbell, of the strange poet who had just arrived in there and his family, and they all wanted to help him, they wanted to recognize him, and they even wanted the possibility of Roy Campbell entering their community. He used to live in the urban area, a mile and a half away from the center, from the village center, and for that reason he started, thanks to the help of Mary Garman, his wife, they started visiting Father Gregorio Llorca Barceló. And Father Gregorio Llorca Barceló could be the introducer, the kind of person that would be really important, really vital in making his life, his religious life, reaching that summit he was looking for from the very beginning. He started living in France some years earlier, right? His conversion is due to Father Gregorio because he shared lots of poetry, experiences. They were very cultivated people, and they were wise people in a rural area, and for that reason Roy Campbell wanted to take advantage of it, and also because of the help, the support of his wife, Mary Garman. For that reason, he converted to Catholicism on June the 24th, 1935, and that was a remarkable date in their lives, not only in Roy Campbell's, but also in Mary's and the daughters, Anna and Tess. After being in Altea, they left Altea because Roy Campbell's mother, who was an elderly lady coming from South Africa, didn't like the kind of life they used to have in there, and the kind of life that was getting closer to God, because that community in Altea, in that village, wanted them to be participants, to take part in the, for example, Easter in 1935, some days earlier than his mother came to Altea for the first time. So his mother, Roy Campbell's mother, didn't like the possibility of being in there, and she tried to convince, as hard as she could, for Roy Campbell and the whole family leave Altea and go to, for example, Madrid or just to England. Actually, she was able to manage Tess, Roy Campbell's elder daughter, and to take her to England just for her studies. On the contrary, Roy Campbell and his wife, Mary Garman, decided to stay in Toledo. Toledo, which was the sacred city of his mind. And that sacred city and that mind, those are religious elements we find in that approach, in that recent approach he had previously in Altea, thanks to Father Gregorio Llorca Barceló. Myth-like Emblems, that's the book produced today. It was on the 19th of October 1936, so 81 years ago today. The 19th of October, that's the very first edition of Myth-like Emblems. And it's a kind of tribute, or a kind of homage to Mithras, as I told you before, the Roman god. And it has to do with the communion, the union of both Mithras and the religious faith he has embraced previously in Altea. He had been in Toledo for roughly 14 months, okay, but the Spanish Civil War started on July 18th in 1936, and he had to leave after, or basically just to allow his family being safe and sound. And that's the reason why he took them to England, to the south of England, in order to make them escape from war, from conflict, and basically to avoid some different problems he had had previously from the elections, the general elections in February 1936. I mean, before the Spanish Civil War. Roy Campbell was spotted. He was a very important figure in Toledo. In that city, in which there were roughly 28,000 inhabitants, but Roy Campbell was, as we call nowadays, the Giri. He was a strange person, the Zulu poet. He had lots of contacts in there with the mayor, with the previous mayor, with the people who were around him, and basically with two other important characters, Father Gregorio and Father Evaristo. They were Carmelite, or the Scots Carmelites, in the convent. They used to go for Mass every morning at 8 a.m. And even Mary Garman was so bold, so daring, that she challenged the snipers during the war, during the first weeks of the war, and just to go with her missal, and just to go to church every day with Anna, the youngest daughter. Okay, she was only 8 years old at that time. So just to have an idea of how daring, how bold, how aggressive they were in their religious convictions. Mithraic emblems was the consequence, was the result in 1936 in October. I mean, it was a day like today, the 19th, when coming back to England to make them safe and sound, and he was so enraged, he was so angry with the situation that they were living in Spain, that he decided to write his poetry, a collection of poetry he hadn't written before because he was so busy during his journey, his trip from the south of England to Alicante, Barcelona first, Alicante, Altea, and Toledo. He had abandoned poetry, but he needed to place those feelings just to tell everybody he was a Christian, and his arrival into Catholicism was supposed to be really vital in his life. Not only in his life, but also in Mary Garman's, his wife. For that reason, he wrote Mithraic Emblems. The book I'm going to refer to, not as a whole, because it's really big. There are lots of poems in here. It's not like those 5 poems, for example, Antonio said previously, or the one Javier said before. We could talk, for example, about the first part, which were composed of 22 sonnets, and those sonnets, just having a look at it, the title is Mithraic Emblems or Mithraic Frieze, as the most important, as the most detailed, as the most remarkable part of the collection of poems. Also included in here, after Mithraic Frieze, was Toledo 1936, just to know how important it represented it was in his life. And it was composed of 10 other sonnets, right? And finally, the least important regarding the arrival, the approach to God, was the third part, which was Horizon. So we got Mithraic Frieze, which was called so in the collected poems in the first version in 1949. But initially, in Mithraic Emblems, it was called Mithraic Emblems. The second one, as I told you, was Toledo, just to know how important it was. That city we have 50 miles away from here. And also Horizon, just to depict, just to have a portrait of the situation lived, the hard situation lived in Toledo by Roy Campbell and the whole family. What we have to take into account regarding the importance of the city and the importance of the production of this book, it was in October 1936, after some findings with or encounters with Wyndham Lewis at the beginning of October in London, when he left his place in the south of England, was how remarkable it was because of the title. As I told you before, there was a kind of union between Mithras, and he had tried to do some research to investigate about the connection with those shrines, those figures, those religious feelings rural people used to have in the campsite, in the rural areas in southern France. Also, it is important to consider the topics, the issues he made use of in his poetry. In the first part, for example, Roy Campbell mentions, it's something you can read more deeply, as I told you initially, in the document I emailed Antonio Barnes this morning, but it's up to you to read it. But just to have some examples, on the whole, he mentions the bull, he mentions the sun, mythology, bullfighting, the touring world he had discovered previously in the south of France too. Cowboys, he was a tough and strong cowboy too, and influenced by the horses on the Camargue, right? Mithras, the Mediterranean area, colors and light. Some topics covered also previously by my predecessor, for example. He knew lots of nature. He knew, for example, lots of things more than Fernando, more than me on birds. He knew the meaning of all the birds. For example, the albatross, he mentions, for example, in one of the poems, as the bird just having one mate throughout all his or her life. And that's something he represents as Christ. The same as the raven. He dedicates 3 poems in the middle part of Mithraic emblems, the one called, or just the final elements in there, the one called Mithraic frieze. And the raven is not a contradictory or a negative bird. For Roy Campbell, it's a kind of resurrection. It is a kind of bird that allows him to resurrect and to become someone important in life, something like the ave phoenix. So we got some images of birds because he knew lots of them, and he had them reflected on his poems. Also, it is important to consider the origin, why Mithraic emblems. Apart from the reasons I told, apart from the connections of the South African background, the importance of light, scenery, sun, it is also important to consider the remembrance, that reminding of Roman times, and also to Mistral, a Provençal poet, who was a kind of, or the instigator, the perpetrator of the introductory poem he's got here in Provençal French. About the titles, as I told you before, I mentioned those referred to the raven. There were 3 on the whole referred to the raven, but with a different idea as the one we are used to. Also, for example, the altar is a place where Roy Campbell is immolated. Okay? The altar is something like the immolation of his own life. Also, the solar enemy refer obviously to the sun, how important it is, and the power of the sun, not only in his life but also in his poetry. Illumination, the 3rd title of those 22 sonnets combined to make up, to establish the first part, Mithraic frieze. Illumination obviously has to do with light, and light derived from the sun. And the sun is represented by Mithras initially, the Roman god, and also by Christ. The 7 swords. The 7 swords has to do with bullfighting initially, and how the bull is killed, is murdered, is slain by the bullfighter, by the matador, by the torero, right? And how important he is with his Veronicas and his cape when trying to play with the bull or just trying to be at the bullfighting ring. Each sword had a meaning, and he also wrote out of those 22 sonnets, one dedicated to each sword, like the hard cross in Virgin Mary. For example, the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th swords. But it is important to remind you, or to remind us of how important it was, the 6th one, because it takes him back to Toledo again. Toledo is always on his mind. It's just the sacred city of his mind. Toledo, the raven, the morning, and the dawn. The morning and the dawn are other 2 titles we find in here within those 22. And the dawn represents a kind of allusion, a kind of reference to St. John of the Cross, one of the people leading him to, after his reading obviously, to Catholicism and his conversion as well. So San Juan Sins is another poem dedicated to the saint, to the Carmelite saint, before dealing with the 3 last ones. Mithras number 1, Mithras number 2, Mithras the 1st, Mithras the 2nd. That's the voice of the God who wants that union with God, with Christ, and being the predecessors of the ritual, of the rites of Catholicism, which were initially represented in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries by Romans, in Roman times. So it had been a long time ago, and Roy Campbell had been able to recover, to take those ideas, those images, the whole imagery of the Roman times and the Mithraism into Catholicism. The final poem is To the Sun, which initially in Mithraic emblems wasn't included in the remarkable, in the most important, in the initial frieze, but it was postponed. But in the collected poems, 13 years later, it was collected just to make up 23 instead of 22. It was because To the Sun was added as a kind of thanking to God because of having the sun, having light, and the use of colors, the importance of nature, all the hues, all the pitches of colors, and being so major, so important, so remarkable, and having the primacy over shape and form. That's something he tried to point out in the final poems of this first part. The second block, as I told you, is the one he wrote in October as well, October 1936, in his nomadic, in his exile in England, while he was suffering about the things, for example, happened to all those people during the siege of the Alcázar, which had been relieved, which had been liberated a few weeks earlier. So it was something he had in mind, and he even prayed the rosary every day with Mary, with their children, with Anantes in England, in the, as he called it, the Bolshevik Binstead, where he used to live during his retirement in England, next to Binstead in West Sussex. Toledo, 1936, was that second block, and it did appear as a kind of recognition and a kind of connection or liaison with the part, the poems, the time he had spent in Spain. He was really thankful to the city of God, as he called it, and that's why he included titles such as, for example, the Alcázar Mind. The Alcázar Mind, taking into account the siege of the Alcázar previously. The Alcázar Mind represented by that rock of faith. Faith, rock, is something, is a symbol of strength, a symbol of being brave, of being courageous. All those things are considered in the poem. The same as Toledo, July 1936, when he saw the roof of the Carmel going down. So that idea of the Carmel, the Carmelite convent, was in there. As it was, for example, the figure of a bleeding Christ hung on the wall. It was something right in there, like those two other poems he included in here with the titles Christ in uniform and Christ in hospital. So that's the relevance we come across, we find in the final poems in this part of Toledo, right before reaching the horizon. In these two poems, Christ in uniform and Christ in hospital, one of them dedicated to Father Evaristo, who was another very good friend of his. Roy Campbell wanted basically to remark, to point out how important the presence of Christ was in the difficult moments, in those moments of the conflict, through a hospital, the visit to a hospital, and the presence, for example, of Father Evaristo, who was able to manage and to save his life, unlike Father Eusebio and Father Evaristo, and the other fathers of the Carmelites who were harshly murdered by the Red Militia. Okay? And just the final two poems in here would be The Fight and would be Hot Rifles. In all of them, in all 6 out of 10 poems within this second block of poems regarding Toledo, the presence of Christ is evident. In Hot Rifles, because he's witnessing the situation. The same as in The Fight. In that fighting between two planes, one representing Franco's band, Franco's side, and the other of the Red Army. And Christ is in there as the most important, as the most powerful image, and the most important and the most powerful figure, right there coming from the moon, okay? And he is superior to anything that could be here on our earth, right? As a conclusion, and just to finish it up, I'd like to mention also how important the figure of Mary Garman was in his religious conviction. I think that Mary Garman played an important role in taking the role or leading his husbands in those moments in which he didn't have the possibility of being so loyal to Christ, to Catholicism. But she was in there, even in this stage, or during this stage in Spain, also in England, and in her final years, final decades, in Portugal. Roy Campbell's conservatism is also important to consider because he embraced the faith in such a way that made him really strong, and just to attack and to be exposed to all criticism coming from the literary coterie, the literary set, basically from Bloomsbury, taking into account that Roy Campbell supported Franco. He was a soldier. he was also a Catholic, so he had all the ingredients to be strongly denied. So Roy Campbell was in there. Unfortunately, he was able to survive in those hard situations. Finally, his conversion is an important thing to consider. He converted to Catholicism in 1935, and he was really happy. He was overjoyed with the possibility of being a Christian not only in Spain, which was rather difficult in those times before the war, but also it was really important being a Catholic and being the godfather of some other writers, like, for example, Edith, how was her name? Edith Sitwell and other Sitwells, and he was even the godfather of all of them. He didn't deny his condition of being a Catholic. He was really proud of it, and for that reason, he continued on his way to God through his nomadic life, a nomadic journey to literature. Thank you so much.
Pues muy breve me temo, pero tiempo para alguna pregunta o comentario que deseen ustedes hacer.
Bueno, gracias a los dos, al profesor Ariza y profesor Domínguez, por las brillantes exposiciones, ¿no? Yo me voy a centrar en la figura de Campbell porque para mí es un hallazgo y me ha sorprendido mucho. Iba pues leyendo digamos, esta síntesis de su tesis. Dos preguntas concretas que me surgen. Una es, bueno, si las traducciones de San Juan de la Cruz que menciona, pues que fueron muy célebres, siguen siendo a día de hoy o se consideran como traducciones canónicas o son traducciones consultadas realmente en lengua inglesa, digamos, qué vigencia conservan o si han sido, digamos, revisadas. Y por otro lado, mencionan un punto que este poema de, bueno, emblemas mitraicos, ¿no? Sí. Que supone este giro, ¿no? Digamos, de un hombre ya católico con fe o que va orientado en esa línea, pero menciona que al mismo tiempo, como que en ese libro ya se ve un descenso de la calidad poética. ¿Me sorprende esto?
¿Un descenso de?
Descenso de la calidad poética. Yo me sorprende esto y, bueno, no sé, de alguna forma usted podrá argumentar o en qué se basa, digamos, este descenso de su calidad poética y también si siguió entonces produciendo poesía, pero a nivel inferior. Le digo porque me ha sorprendido en el sentido que lo desconozco, si esto es así, pero que, por ejemplo, se comenta también de Eliot. Hay como una especie, y lo he observado en otros autores, ¿no? En autores conversos en los que hay una primera parte en las que se le cita con gran elogio, pues en Eliot, por ejemplo, es el Wasteland, es La tierra baldía, es el gran poema vanguardista, y en cambio los cuatro cuartetos ya, bueno, es como, sí, de este poeta católico, que formalmente está bien, pero ya no era el poeta que fue, ¿no? No digo que usted haya hecho lo mismo, por supuesto, pero si me puede a lo mejor aclarar a qué se debe este descenso de la calidad.
Vale. Por parte de la primera cuestión referida a San Juan de la Cruz y su traducción, una ardua traducción porque le llevó aproximadamente 11 años hacerlo, hasta ganar el Foyle Prize en 1952, entregado precisamente por uno de sus detractores, Stephen Spender, en enero del 52, al que le había pegado, de hecho, por haberle insultado. Roy Campbell era un tipo de armas tomar, evidentemente, no se casaba con nadie. Entonces, la presencia de San Juan de la Cruz no solamente atañe a lo que es el catolicismo, sino también al anglicanismo, porque es una figura relevante en la iglesia anglicana y que se lee también en la iglesia anglicana. Por tanto, había una Aliston McPherson, había un jesuita que había hecho una traducción previa, pero evidentemente, ya que ha estado por aquí pululando el nombre de Borges, Borges decía que la traducción al inglés que había hecho Roy Campbell superaba o era excelsa desde su conocimiento del español, evidentemente, de Borges, que no lo he dicho, pero Roy Campbell aprende español gracias a Borges y a Rubén Darío. Son lecturas poéticas en español que hace y realmente le introducen dentro de nuestro idioma, ¿no? Entonces, esa tenía tal calidad que realmente fue muy valorada, a pesar de que fue unos años antes de su muerte. Roy Campbell se había quitado, esa tara política, al haber defendido a Franco, estaba en el ojo del huracán, pero él se había presentado voluntario en la Segunda Guerra Mundial para luchar con Inglaterra contra el nazismo, ¿no? O sea que él se había limpiado su imagen, que era uno de los propósitos que personalmente intenté con mi tesis, ¿no? Entonces el valor de la poesía se mantiene y se ha mantenido y la gente reconoce, incluso en los estudios actuales o hasta hace unas décadas en Inglaterra, igual que uno de los poemas que he citado sobre Horses on the Camargue, las traducciones de Roy Campbell son referentes en el mundo anglosajón, como por ejemplo el estudio de Lorca. porque Roy Campbell apreciaba, amaba la poesía y no quería ningún tipo de connotación política, a pesar de que esa era la idea, la imagen que querían venderte desde el exterior, sobre todo sus detractores. Contaron tantas y tantas mentiras que, como decía Goebbels, al final se hizo verdad. Y por eso le costó tanto a Roy Campbell intentar revertir esa situación. La segunda tiene que ver con la calidad poética. La calidad poética yo creo que viene marcada principalmente por la alta consideración que tiene de Flaming Terrapin, que he mencionado un par de veces, cuando con 22 años irrumpe, 22 años Roy Campbell, un poeta que nadie conoce, recién llegado de South Africa, 2 años antes, y sin comerlo ni beberlo se planta, reconocido por T.S. Eliot, que es uno de sus principales valedores, y Auguste Jean, por ejemplo, y le sitúan en el disparadero, en lo que es el hit de la poesía británica, con influencias frescas que no tienen nada que ver con lo que se estilaba por aquella época. Las referencias, evidentemente, venían dadas precisamente por Rubén Darío, en el modernismo que tenemos escrito en español, o, por ejemplo, Baudelaire o Verlaine, que también los tradujo. Él había traducido, fue tan capaz de traducir a estos, como el que citaba mi predecesor antes aquí, Javier, acerca de Pessoa. Me decía una sobrina de Pessoa en Portugal, hablando de un poema que se titulaba Conquer the Death, la muerte conquistada, que ella, que era portuguesa, no sentía nada leyendo el poema en portugués, pero que sentía algo, dice, y no es por mi marido, que es irlandés, pero siento algo al leerlo en inglés. Y es verdad, yo es que no entiendo mucho portugués, pero lo entiende y te dice algo, pero lo lees en inglés y realmente ese reto que ofrece Roy Campbell a la muerte es realmente atractivo, desde un punto de vista poético. Entonces, su calidad creo que viene marcada por esa crítica exacerbada que hacen sus detractores. Y de hecho, el anterior poemario, que había sido Flowering Wraiths, no tuvo nada que aportar. Para mí, Mithraic Emblems tiene más calidad que Flowering Wraiths, más que de Georgette y más que, por ejemplo, de Waste Goose, que fueron sátiras por su situación crítica y la rabieta que tenía de ser expulsado de Sudáfrica, de ser expulsado, ahí viene el tema del nomadismo, de Inglaterra, y encontrarse en Francia, en Inglaterra, de ser expulsado por consecuencias de la guerra y decir, tengo que escribir algo de lo que está pasando en España. Y lo refleja en esos magníficos sonetos, 22, 23, y que incluimos el último, To the Sun, de la primera parte, desde mi punto de vista, y con una idea nueva, la misma que había introducido desde el punto de vista modernista en un principio, 14 años antes, con The Flaming Terrapin, con esa tortuga del mar llameante, la introduce con Mithraic Emblems, con un personaje, la figura de Mithras, que supone algo nuevo, algo novedoso, que luego lo refrenda con la situación política que vive en España, pero que no se mete en el atolladero. Para eso tenía Flowering Rifle, 1939. A partir de ahí sí que fue evidentemente fusilado literariamente de todos los ámbitos. No solamente Roy Campbell, sino muchos investigadores contemporáneos en nuestra Europa actual han sido sacados de sus universidades, como por ejemplo Michael Hanken y ese en Alemania, que fue una de las personas que validó mi tesis, por el hecho de escribir un libro sobre The Romance Country, los países en los que estuvo Roy Campbell. Realmente es una situación que no nos resulta atípica a la situación que vivimos hoy en día, pero Roy Campbell tuvo grandes dotes de vaticinador. Y fue una persona que se adelantó a sus acontecimientos, que se opuso al mundo moderno y lo supo reflejar. Entonces, la calidad poética aquí decrece si lo comparamos con las ideas que transmitían de Flaming Terrapin 14 años antes. Y tenga en cuenta que hay un gran vacío. Él no produce literatura, excepto Broken Record, que es una primera parte de su biografía narrativa, que la hace para ganar 30 libras esterlinas cuando llega a Barcelona. La escribe en 3 o 4 días, inventándose cosas, además. Esa es su biografía, porque Roy Campbell sabía salir al paso. Era un tipo que sabía realmente buscarse la vida.
Muy bien, pues...
Nada.
Sí, pues se cierra esta sesión. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.